square, I guess. Marijuana square or something.
Okay. Good evening. Can everyone hear me? Yeah? Okay. Welcome. Welcome to this talk that's called Education, Free and Unafraid, a dialogue seeking a path forward in education, engaging the life and experience of educator Msgr Luigi Giussani. So when some of us started organizing this this talk tonight, we actually were moved by the publication of the English language edition of the biography of Father Giussani, written by Alberto Savorana, who we have here tonight. So the biography of Luigi Giussani, the founder of the movement of communion and liberation that several of us belong to here tonight. And then actually, as we were sort of reading the book and discussing it together, we came to realize that education was sort of the key contribution that seemed to be offered by Father Giussani over the course of his life. So we actually sort of narrowed down the book. If you saw it on the table, it's quite large. And so we started meeting regularly and working on just the chapters on education. And what really struck us was sort of the similarity between the situation that he found himself to be confronting as an educator. He began teaching in a public high school in Milan, Italy, during the late 50s and then early 60s. And he describes in the biography, he describes the situation he had in front of him as sort of meeting students, many of whom were Catholic, because Italy in the 50s was very much a Catholic country, but who didn't really have a motivation behind their faith, or even they had been sort of given a tradition that didn't speak to them, and that they didn't really know what to do with, and that predictably, they would abandon, as happened. And a lot of this, as we were reading, struck us as similar to what we're living now, right? We have the crisis in the church, but even just more generally, the question of like, what does our faith have to do with everyday life, and are young people today sort of introduced to this or not? There's a quote from the biography that really struck me. Father Giussani says, "Never before has the environment been able to invade consciences so despotically." And this was before the internet, right? Social media. "Young people need to be helped to judge truth through correspondence of their experience. They must experience the universal value of the proposal themselves." So as we were organizing this talk tonight, we really wanted to invite people who would help us understand better sort of what this means. So what was Father Giussani's position in front of this sort of increasingly secularized environment that he was educating in? What was his contribution, and what can we take from that today? And so we've invited speakers who are educators and who are engaged with Christian education at the level of method, at the level of the crisis that Father Giussani sort of pinpointed. So not so much asking themselves, what is it that we need to teach in the form of contact, but how do we give and offer young Christian youth a method to be a presence today. So our first speaker, Dr. Connor Hill, has a PhD in theology from the Pontifical John Paul II Institute for Studies on Marriage and Family in Washington, D.C., and he's taught in both public and Catholic secondary schools and also at the university level. And he is currently the headmaster and also theology teacher of a high school called Chesterton Academy of the Holy Family in Downers Grove, Illinois. Our second speaker, I'll introduce everyone and then we'll get started, is Tim O'Malley, who is the Director of Education at the McGrath Institute for Church Life at the University of Notre Dame. He's also the Academic Director of the Center for Liturgy at Notre Dame, teaches and researches at Notre Dame in liturgical sacramental theology, catechesis, and theological aesthetics. He is also married to Kara and has 2 children. And then Alberto Savorana at my right, who is the author of the biography of Father Giussani, has worked as a professional journalist since 1987. In 93, he began collaborating on a series of books in collaboration with Father Luigi Giussani himself, and then more recently, Father Julian Carron. And the book, I believe, was published in the original edition in 2013, The Life of Father Giussani. Okay, so to get us started, I would just like to ask both of you, maybe Connor, you could start. What would you say is the most unique contribution that Father Giussani gave in terms of method of education, and sort of what have you found to be most helpful in your own work from reading him?
Thank you. So I wanted to keep my comments this evening fairly concrete. So I want to talk about my experience. So first of all, my experience when I was a student, and this was my first exposure to this method of education that we see in Father Giussani's work. And so I guess the 2 aspects that came to mind in thinking about this is this idea of living reality intensely and then Christianity as an event. So 2 professors of mine, one at undergrad, Professor Regis Martin, I took his Introduction to Catholicism class back in the late 90s. And I remember sitting in his class and thinking that I'd never heard anyone speak like this before about Christianity, and propose the person of Christ in such a fascinating way. He quoted T.S. Eliot, Hopkins, Peggy, and I think in this vein, he was very much like Father Giussani, quoting a lot of poetry. And his class awakened a wonder in me regarding Catholicism. And the second teacher was in my days at graduate school. One of the members of the Fraternity of St. Charles Borromeo, Father Antonio Lopez, taught me a Christology class my second semester. And the title of the class was Eius Dulcis Presentia, His Sweet Presence. So needless to say, this wasn't some sort of lifeless theology class, but the class was structured on a series of questions that were asked to the person of Christ. So what do you have to say about yourself was one of the questions, or who do you say that I am? And from this experience of theology, I came to see it as an opportunity to not to think about something abstractly, but to dialogue with the person of Christ. Father Antonio once said, and I'll never forget this, he said, "Heaven forbid that what we're doing here in this classroom ever become abstract." And so my 2 years in the master's program were like a second conversion, where the understanding of the faith and the wonder regarding the person of Christ and of the church changed the way that I saw my life and changed the way that I saw the world, such that I myself moved toward dedicating my life to communicating the intelligibility of the faith in such a way that it responds to life's needs. So, I mean, just 2 things about his method that I learned from these 2 teachers and that I experienced in my own life. One is this method, education is a method for encountering reality, and for living intensely and for entering into the totality of the real. And then the second was this real fascination regarding the person of Jesus and how theology can be a way to deepen that fascination, deepen that wonder regarding Christ.
Thank you. Yeah, that's helpful also, because one of the things that Father Giussani sort of always underlines, you know, in the book too, is how what educates is an experience. So even hearing you sort of tell us how, you know, how you first understood the pertinence of theology in your life is basically the method in action, right? You were fascinated by these educators, and then you took seriously their hypothesis. So thank you. Tim, what do you?
Oh, here.
I'll take both microphones. No. Okay. Well, thanks so much for being here this evening, and thanks so much for inviting me. For me, I came across Giussani rather late in my life, my career life. I mean, the sort of later part of my student life. I was actually in my first year teaching at the University of Notre Dame when some undergraduates, or graduate students rather, in our master's program wanted to do a course in Christian philosophy of education. And I was actually relatively frustrated with this question, because I had done my PhD at Boston College in theology in education, focusing primarily on Augustine. And I had a real sort of reticence of anything that was modern. I saw sort of philosophy of ed in the modern age as basically falling apart. I did an entire comms question on the work of John Dewey, and at the end concluded that he even gave up being a Hegelian at the end for it was unclear what. And so it was kind of like I was in this state of wondering whether anyone could articulate in the modern age a kind of a sufficient philosophy of education. At the same time, you know, I was an academic, but I was an academic who was very frustrated with the academy. The academy is a dreadfully abstract place at times. I would always go to parties as a student, as if I went to all parties, but I would always go to parties as a student, and everyone there would be talking about either departmental politics or like the latest book that they read. And I always wanted to say, like, but did you, like, what else do you do with your life? Like, have you, are you dating someone? Who are you friends with? Tell me about where you grew up. I didn't need everything to be sort of existentialism. And so I found finally a kind of educational approach that combined my two concerns. First, you had a sort of educational approach that wasn't secularized, but also wasn't sectarian. It was open to engagement with reality, with the real, as I think sort of Connor said so well, while also really, really deeply aware of the way that divine revelation functioned and the manner in which the educator, in essence, has to perform this divine revelation each time. God, after all, we're in Lent, right? And so in the Exodus, God doesn't like force Israel at any point. Teaching Israel to love is the hardest pedagogical task that God has in the desert. And so there's a freedom of this act. There's a chance, a kind of engagement of love, a real sort of proposal that one has to take up. At the same time that I could bring my whole self to this. Like as a scholar, I didn't have to pretend that I also wasn't like a husband, someone who wanted to be a dad, someone who was delighted in Boston area sports. Like I could actually bring a full self to the educative act, even as a university professor. And that actually my students might find what I'm doing to be more engaging if I did this. This was also really great news for me because I was dreading the idea that I was going to lecture for an hour and 15 minutes on topics that I had no clue what I was doing. That's the secret of college teaching, is you're teaching a thing you don't know. And so I didn't want to, I not only did I not want to lecture for an hour and 15 minutes every class? I literally couldn't, because I was reading one book ahead of the students. So to read Giussani was sort of an awakening in my mind that I could educate in a Catholic way, in a Christian way, in a human way, without succumbing to either sectarianism or secularism, which had been my sort of previous experience with philosophy of ed.
Thank you. So now I just wanted to ask Alberto if you had something to add or wanted to comment about those experiences.
First of all, thanks to all of you for the invitation, because the possibility to share something I found during my job for writing this book is so important in order to do a verification. If Father Giussani has something to say right now in your situation, in the situation of this world 2019, that can be useful for your job, for your responsibility in the, I suppose, the most important field in the world, education. Because for Father Giussani, from the education, on the education depends the future of the world, the future of the people, because it regards the young people. So our future depends on the capacity that the adults. That is the reason why, for Giussani, education is a matter of the adults at the very beginning, not of the young people. Because if a society is incapable to communicate a meaning, a hope, a certitude for the life to the young generation, a society condemns himself to death. I'm very impressed by from the two points that you stressed at the beginning of your speech. Living reality intensely and Christianity as an event. In Giussani, these two issues are strictly connected. And I suppose that this is his personal answer to the drama of modernity that started almost 5 centuries ago, just to divide humanity, the human experience, and faith. Faith is something private, important for the religion, institution, and life. But when we go in the public square, the criteria changes. Giussani realized this at the very beginning of the 50s, when Italy was a so powerful Catholic country. And overall in Milan, when he became priest, everybody was baptized, married in church. The Catholic values were so strong, they decided also the orientation of politics, but through some occasional encounters with young students. When he was a very young priest in a confessional, make him to be aware that for that young people, so Catholic, faith doesn't matter with their life. One example that struck Father Giussani was that when they did the confession, they confessed to him that when their teacher, not Catholic, during the lesson in the classroom spoke against the faith, church, the Pope, they were confused. They have no reason in themselves to answer, not to fight against, but reason to be Christians with a gaze, full of reason. And he realized that this depended on the lacking of a method that priests and adults and parents didn't touch to the young people in order to verify the faith they received by tradition in parish, in the catechism, in family, in Catholic family. And from the moment that Giussani discovered faith, Christ, as an event in his personal life, where he was very, very young, 15 years old, through his teachers that communicate to him that faith, that Christianity, that Christ is precisely the answer to a man who lives reality intensely, that is aware of his needs, of his longing for beauty, truth, goodness, and finally happiness. He was struck when one of his teachers, named Gaetano Corti, explained the very beginning of the Gospel of St. John, when John said that the Word became flesh. And Corti said, thus the beauty became flesh, the truth became flesh, the goodness became flesh. In a very concrete way, the only way possible for a man to reach truth and beauty, the reality. And so he devoted his life to communicate, as you said, the reasonability of faith. Because for Giussani, faith isn't something sentimental, a feeling, a thought, but is the concreteness of a presence, full of reason, because it corresponds to the human needs. And he was very confident with the idea that if a young person, a human being, doesn't take seriously his humanity, he cannot understand, recognize the answer. The answer is that Christ has a claim to be. This is the reason why for Father Giussani teaching was an act of love. The first day he entered in the high school in Milan in October 1954, he said, I met these unknown students that was very extraneous each other, but I loved them because I was full of love for their destiny. And I started in order to communicate the name of this destiny, Christ. But there were a question, a problem. As you said, a question of method. How can communicate? How can educate as Christians? Because for Giussani it was clear that the problem was that the adult Catholic people, lay and priest, didn't communicate a method. And this method was, for Father Giussani, synthesized with the word experience. The first day he said, I'm not here in order you take my ideas as yours. So I am not here to put in your mind what I thought, what I think, because I am the authority, I am the priest, I am the teacher of Catholic religion. So you have to obey because I am the priest. He said, I'm here in order to communicate you a method through which you personally can judge if what I will tell you in this year is true or not. What act of love was this for Giussani? Before that, unknown students, the first day of school, how was he aware that their heart was the same of his heart, and was a desire of beauty, truth, and goodness. And he put in their hands the instrument to judge, because the criteria to judge was inside there, not in a subjective way, because that criteria would put inside every human being, men and women, by mystery, by God, that create us full of this desire, of the struggle for truth. And he proposed this to an experience, a relationship that was for Giussani not just to try something, to try this and to try that, and go on. For Giussani, experience is full of meaning. It's an encounter with something and someone. And this is the capacity to understand the meaning of what I encounter. And finally, to be aware of the correspondence between the other and me, the proposal and my desires. This is experience. And for Giussani, this is the only way to grow, to become adult. Before the world, in the public square, not in a safe space where everything agree with the category ideas. Because we don't live in a safe space, we live in the reality. My wife is a teacher and living in a public school in Milan with 1,200 young people whose mentality is not Catholic, whose family are not Catholic, are agnostic, non-believers, Muslims. And she cannot teach Christianity as a doctrine or an idea, because she teaches literature, Italian literature. But he can be witness of Christianity, challenging their students, teaching literature on about the most profound question of life that are inside in everybody. So.
Thank you. So one thing that you've all spoken of more or less explicitly is teaching as an act of love, which is what you were saying. And then Tim, you also, when you were talking about God not forcing, but loving, right? And so I guess one question would be, how can we love this freedom? I mean, Giussani talks about risk when he talks about education. That's the title of another of his books that we have there, The Risk of Education, right? Because again, it's not a forcing, but it's sort of showing something that then the person can accept or reject, right? So I don't know, thinking of education, it seems like a lot of times we do this, we educate more out of fear. So the idea is trying to sort of avoid certain experiences, trying to avoid young people being exposed to certain ideas, certain things, right? And even reading Giussani, I mean, the biography, one thing that's so striking is that Giussani seems like he's not afraid of anything. He one thing that had struck me was in this high school in the late 50s, they were talking in his class about different political ideas of the time, and they were talking also about communism. And so Giussani invited a communist to come and speak to the students. So rather than trying to sort of convince them that that was wrong, he said, well, if this is what the communist proposal is, in order to accept it or reject it, you have to understand it deeply. But again, that's a risk, right? Because you're putting them in front of something that they might find attractive and they might choose for themselves. So I guess my question for all of you is, what allows this risk? What makes it possible, convenient? Do you have?
I'll jump in first. So, hello? Hello? Okay. Hello? Hello? Okay. That's loud. So what enables this risk? I guess maybe I'd like to tackle that just from what prevents us from making the risk, right? This January, just a number of different circumstances, both at my school and at home, I was asking myself whether education was possible at all. So for someone who's dedicated themselves to education, this is a dramatic question. There's a certain amount of despair that was there. So just the things that were happening, not to get into the details, but the hopes and methods and certainties that I had previously trusted in seemed to be unfounded or not working. And so it was with this urgency that I picked up these chapters on education in Giussani's biography, with a really urgent need for an answer to my question: is education possible? And as I was reading about his witness, I came to realize that my despair was not simply in the circumstances, not simply in the students that were in front of me, but actually or perhaps more deeply in my own response to the circumstances. And that what I realized was that I'd lost my conviction on a number of levels, or one could say that the loss of my conviction also meant that I abandoned the method, right? The method being I despaired of the human heart in my students. I'd lost sight of this acute awareness that Giussani had, that Christ is everything, and that I need to help my students see this. And so I didn't have a proposal for them. I wasn't capable of seeing that point of contact, which is the heart, right, that they have. And then in the classroom, I noticed that I just wasn't engaging them in the same way. Yeah, I guess without this proposal of Christ, and without this awareness that the heart doesn't lie, one can't take this risk of education. And so, yeah, I just found myself being tremendously jealous of Giussani's conviction as it's presented in the book, and realizing what a loser I am. But anyways, no, so.
One of the things I learned early in my life was the question isn't, do I take a risk, but what risk is taken? What risk is worth taking? And I came to this actual decision very early on, in what seemed like a childlike moment, but in retrospect has been somewhat definitive for my development as a human being, was I wanted a pet for a long time, and we found a cat on our street, and she was a white cat. So we very creatively called her Snowball, which is, I think, the requirement for all cats that are all white. You must call them Snowball. And so she was Snowball, and I loved her very deeply immediately. And I remember like waking up, I was 8 or 9. I remember waking up in a sort of panic, and sort of suddenly aware that the cat that I loved would die, which is the kind of thought you have, I think, if you're either a theologian in training or a serial killer. So like she would die. And I remember running into my grandmother and saying, like, we have to get rid of Snowball because she is going to die and I love her. And my grandmother said, you are foolish. Because, well, she didn't say this, but she said it in the grandmotherly way that one does at 2 o'clock in the morning. You're foolish. If you love anything, then you will never love anything. Right? This is the human risk. To love is to risk the possibility that it will disappear, and it will disappear, right? And so the question of education is, what is worth risking at all? Because the question for the human person isn't, can we avoid risk? Can we minimize it, right? It's, what will we risk? Will I give myself over to this idea that could transform my life? Or will I be too proud to do so? Will I give myself over to the love of my children, right? Who are precarious, and I am increasingly aware of precarity in them as they continue to do everything they can to kill themselves, as young children do. Will I fall in love with this person, right? Who could reject me, and in fact might. Like, there's a certain number of people that will always reject us. So that's the risk of saying, I love you, right? I love you is the riskiest thing to say, because that you could get the return, which is, I don't love you. And I guess like what enables me to think that education can take this risk and the confidence in it is the sheer reality of what we believe. My favorite doctrine in Catholicism and Christianity is the doctrine of the Ascension, which seems sort of odd because it's always the kind of embarrassing moment in homilies where it's like, well, the priest sort of says like, well, Jesus is now in heaven. I guess Easter's over. Thanks. And there's a sort of departure, and then we all leave, and the priest sort of offers an apology about why he's not really in heaven, because like he's not sitting on a cloud, or is he? I don't know. I have children, so I don't hear a homily ever. But that our humanity in all of its brokenness exists at the right hand of the Father. The wounds of love still marked, transformed now through love. That everything that is human has been transfigured with the love, bathed in the love of resurrected life, now eternally there, even present in this church, which seems so wounded at times, yet that humanity exists at the right hand of the Father. To me, that's a risk I'm worth engaging in, and it's why I don't get so concerned when my students seem to sort of initially hate Catholicism. Good. Now I have a live creature in front of me, rather than one who's apathetic. Now I have a humanity to work with. Now you're ready to ask the questions. And so the question for my students I always ask isn't whether you'll risk, it's what are you going to risk? What is it? Because there's going to be something.
Enough. One is enough. No. Very impressive for me your words, because the question of freedom is fundamental in the proposal of Father Giussani, and it depends on the discovery he did of the value of person. In P3, I put the side. In the end of the 50s, after years and years spending with young students in Milan, he said, the person exists beyond all that we feel, beyond all that he does, beyond his own body, beyond his own ideas. Indeed, that person is completely beyond what we see in him. And so, I can even, and I must, love the person who murders me because his personal value goes beyond his evil. Giussani discovered this infinite value of the person. Why? Because he recognized that person belongs to the mystery that created him. And this is the reason why he invited his students, his friends, to respect the person. And you know, we live in a contemporary world whose flag is freedom. But it seemed contradictory that the world that did a so strong effort in order to assure freedom to everybody make so people in a slavery. But the reason of this respect, thanks to this respect, Giussani took the risk of freedom. And he said, there is another page that I want to read in my bad English. Don't sleep, please. 20 lines. Was so impressive for me when I read this judgment by Giussani. Perhaps the greatest sacrifice for parents, of course, the greatest after losing a child, is seeing their child, whom they brought up with love, to whom they gave everything possible to give, make decisions or choose a path or formulate judgments that are different from the ones the parents believe to be correct. Giussani wished in this the temptation to have power over souls, to possess them for their own good, to strip away their freedom to assure their happiness. But the Christian approach, he said, was totally different. Why? Because Christ died to leave us free. So, the more powerful we desire the freedom of our students, the more we gain a deepened respect for their decisions. There can be no happiness for them unless they choose it themselves, and no destiny unless they recognize it and accept it for themselves. Of course, we would like it better if we could just bring them where they need to go. We would like it better if we could go against their freedom, in the sense of their freedom of choice. The only thing that could quell this anxiety is that there is another, who wanted them, who is in strict alliance with them, giving them being. So I put these little daredevils in God's hands. This is something I really did when I was teaching at the high school.
Thank you. So I think we have time for at least one more question for everyone. I guess just since we do have here a principal of a high school and someone who teaches in a university, I'd just be curious to hear. I mean, we've talked about sort of introduction, education as introduction to all of reality. We've talked about totality of reality as basically as meaning the meaning of reality, right? Christ in everything. So sort of a unified proposal versus like, this is what we're teaching, and then we add something because we're Catholics. My question is just, what does this look like, I guess, in your schools, in your departments? Do you, well, I mean, as far as at least your own experiences, you know, as teachers goes, if you could give us an example, maybe. That one. That one's better. That one's better.
So, just to clarify, so is it a question of how the unity of content and method, is that what you're driving at, or I'm just trying to understand? Sort
of. I mean, I guess I'm just wondering about your experience in the classroom with the students. You know, you said sort of what struck you about Giussani, and then you know, and what you find absolutely relevant for today. So I'm just wondering, how do you understand, like, as a teacher, like, what does this method look like where you are?
Right. Again, I guess seeing this now, one of the things that really struck me is that everything was, for Giussani, everything was secondary to the communication, right? To this communication of Christianity as an event, or this awakening of the needs of the heart. And the days that I'm a good teacher are the days when I keep those goals in focus, right? It's not about covering this much material. It's not about you know, having them recite back to me, you know, something that I've told them, but when I keep in mind that the goal of this class is to awaken their heart, right? The goal of this class is to bring them to a point where they're making a judgment in light of their own life regarding the meaning of this or that. So one thing that I've started doing, because with my freshman students, is they've been doing a weekly journal, and so we're reading through the Old Testament, and so I'll pick out some passage or some quotation from the Old Testament, and I ask them over the space of the week. So one of which was had to do with Jacob and him abandoning all these other gods because the Lord rescued him in his time of distress, right? So for their journal entry for the week, I said, okay, so when I quoted the passage, and I said, so when has this happened in your life, right? When has the Lord answered you in your time of distress such that you're willing to let go of these other things that you cling to? And again, I mean, some of their responses are beautiful and striking. And one of the things that I was insistent with them was that they didn't give me a discourse. They didn't talk in terms of generalities or some general thing, but in the very specific details of your life, how has this happened, right? So I'm trying to help them understand that the Lord is at work in their life, and he's doing the same thing that he does for Jacob in your life. So can we see it, right? So I'm working on that, and I want to give them an opportunity to begin to share those moments with one another in order to cultivate among them as a class not only their own personal capacity for judgment, but they're learning how to judge by listening to one another. So that's sort of one concrete thing, but yeah.
One of the things I noticed about schools and universities in particular is that they tend to view human flourishing exclusively in terms of economic production. In other words, the really happy person is the one who succeeds, which in essence means they make money, they cure cancer, they are the first person to do this thing that has never been done ever. And as I like to tell my undergraduates, most of you will do none of those things. Not because I don't love them, I do, but they just won't. And one of the things that universities are really bad at, and schools are really bad at, is preparing human beings to do that which is most important, which is to be a dad, a mom, or parent to a kid. And so one of the things that I started doing was I was very concerned about this. It was one year at commencement, it was really bad. Our major commencement speaker, you know, our administration is always saying, like, you will go be the best thing ever. We give you your degree, but it means nothing until you do something with it. And then we had these two politicians, a Democrat and a Republican, very prominent, who both got up and didn't talk about their careers, but they talked about their families. And I had like a cognitive disorientation. Here are people we're praising for having accomplished things, and the only thing they want to talk about are their kids. And then we're telling our students the only thing you'll ever do that matters is your career. And so I wanted to blow that up. And so I teach this course on the sacrament of marriage and family life to undergrads, which started out with 40 and now is at 150. And one of the things I want to get them to realize is I want to help them and provoke from them a sense that the most important thing they'll do for most of them is be a dad or a mom, to be a husband or a spouse. And I think one of the things that I figured out in practice is it means that I have to actually show them what that means. Like, I, as a university professor, have to describe awkward moments. Like when I learned to be patient with my spouse, my wife. When I learned to say I love you, when I learned to sort of say I'm sorry to my 5-year-old, which is one of the hardest things to do as a human being, is to learn to apologize to your 5-year-old. Because there's nothing more embarrassing than to recognize that you have failed. And you didn't have to for a 5-year-old. That's the gift, because you could tell the 5-year-old you're right. But when you say, like, I'm sorry, I overreacted, that's hard. And to sort of give them icons of this, but also to show them it. I think what's been most stunning to me as an educator is how much it's united my two lives, right? I have a professional life and I have a personal life. A lot of men in particular aren't allowed to talk about their personal lives. It's sort of considered like not allowed. And so it's united it. And suddenly, like, I look, even as a teacher, I look at my life with my kids differently. I start to notice them differently. I start to notice my spouse differently. And I feel united as a person for the first time teaching this. And so I think in a lot of ways, we need in our educational institutions not to create separate schools that are apart from families. I think Giussani speaks very well about this in much of his literature, but to realize that in the end, it's about a creation of a culture and a space where all dimensions of what it means to be human can enter in. And so very practically at an educational level, it means actually talking about it and making it sort of public and not something to sort of just be passed over.
Thank you. So just a quick follow-up. Could you explain a little bit more, since this is something that Father Giussani talks about a lot too, what is culture?
The author of the major biography can do that.
I give you my time.
No, you please. I mean, I literally please.
No. There is another question, because I was impressed by your last two speeches. I just pushed. For Giussani, it was clear that education is not just to prepare in economic terms to the future, to get money He didn't hate money, but the first goal of education is not this. And it's possible only if the teacher, the adult, teacher or father or mother, doesn't matter, communicates himself, their service. Because it's a life. Education is an act of love, and it's a life. And to communicate oneself means to share, to show in the personal way of facing the reality. His personal relationship with the things, with the world. And this is the reason why many students at the very beginning in the high school where Giussani went to teach were struck from this strange priest that went to school and during the hour of the Catholic religion play classical music. And once a girl, a very young student, during a lesson, hearing the concert for piano and orchestra, for violin and orchestra by Beethoven, begins to cry because she realized a connection between that so powerful music and her heart that was made for beauty, and through beauty for truth. I remember last year my wife talked about during night she conducted one of his class student to the theater where was performed a Greek tragedy that he had explained during the lesson. So we go to watch. At a certain point, one of the actors said something, a quotation, and in the very silence of the theater, one of her students, a girl, 15 years old, exclaimed, "It's me!" So he recognized in the drama of the protagonist his personal drama. And at the end, the actor came in the lobby looking for that girl and he said, "Thanks a lot, because you gave me the most important gift I could receive tonight. Because I succeeded in moving something inside you. But if my wife, as a teacher, teaching a Greek tragedy, wouldn't have moved something in terms of comprehension, of use of reason and hearts, that girl couldn't say that in the theater." And the other question, you said the education to prepare to what is more important. You said mother, father, husband, wife. And Giussani translate this with this sentence: life as vocation. This is the most important goal for an adult person. Doesn't matter if you are mother, father, priest, nun. And this is the very usefulness of life. When he became priest in 1945, Giussani said, "I don't want to live uselessly. This is my obsession." And he identified how could be useful. I don't cry, I cry only for two things: the eternal unhappiness of my brother man, and the earthly unhappiness of my brother man, that is a sign of the eternal. God has chosen me in order to communicate the great joy that the answer is a present, is an event, and it's possible to encounter it.
Thank you. Did you want to add, or are you satisfied with?
Well, I think culture is life. There is nothing, there is no cultural. You often hear people today say something like, you know, good riddance to cultural Catholicism. Now we can have a real one. And I always say to myself, what are you talking about? There is no Catholicism without culture, because there is no culture without life. Cult is its vitality. It means that it's more that it's not just sort of high art, but it's the whole sort of manner and form of life by which we make sense of existence. We take it up. What do we have? What hypothesis do we have to offer the next generation if we don't have concrete forms of life by which to offer to someone to say, this is the mode? So that's culture in sort of a nutshell for me. It's linked very closely to worship, right? Because cult is linked to culture, right? So what do we worship? And how does what we worship transform every dimension of our life?
Mary?
Sure.
No, because Giussani learned the meaning of the term culture when he was about 11 years old. Not because in seminary taught lesson about culture, but for an event that happened during the Easter time, when he went back to home, and one morning, walking with his mother to the parish to attend a mass, I read, I was a young seminarian, my eyes still wet with the first years of homesickness. I came home for Easter, and there was a Giorgio's clear blue sky with only the morning star in it, Venus. While me and my wife were walking against the wind toward the parish, she said, how beautiful is the world, and how great is God. But he said, like you would say, polenta and milk are good. And Giussani recognized that his poor mother, that didn't do university or a master in Harvard, has a concept of culture that is most powerful, because she related the last star, Venus, with the entire world and with the meaning of the world. So the beauty of the sky pushed her in order to recognize the Lord, the mystery that did it. For Giussani, this is culture, and it is available for everybody, also for a mom, a poor mom, and a baby 11 years old. And every development in terms of knowledge and experience is a development of this beginning. Otherwise, culture is an abstract job that doesn't matter with life. So at the very end, it's unuseful.
Okay, thank you. I think we're out of time. Just to conclude, I wanted to just kind of go back to the questions that we started with. And so it seems from what everyone has said that the answer to what is a Christian education is it's a human education. Everyone spoke about sort of the need of engaging the whole self, both the self of the educator and who is communicating at the end of the day nothing other than his own life, his own self. And on the other side, engaging the entire self of the student, of the young person, right? And this, I mean, this is ultimately is the method, right? So I guess my main takeaway from tonight is not so much thinking about what is it that we need to sort of provoke in the student, in the child, and who we have in front of us, but what are we proposing? What are we living? What are we communicating? And then sort of to go back to what Connor was saying in the beginning, do we really believe, do we really trust in the fact that Christ is everything? You said that Christ is the most attractive thing. And do we really trust, do we really believe in the fact that the children, the students that we have in front of us have this heart that it was made to recognize truth? So yeah, I mean, that's the most sort of valuable sort of reversal of perspective that that I'm taking away from tonight. And then I know we probably have a lot of other questions. Unfortunately, we don't have time for a Q&A, but the speakers will be here after we're done. There are refreshments in the back, so I mean, I'm sure they'll be happy to talk to you, answer other questions. We also have copies of the biography of Luigi Giussani here, so if you want a signed copy, the author is available for that as well. Yeah, so thanks. Let's thank the speakers once again, and thank you everyone for coming.